Buongiorno, everybody. Good morning, good evening, good evening. Welcome to Clanker Radio Live. My name is Kevin, and today we're talking about PCOS, now renamed PMOS, and the almost century-long mistake that medicine is only now formally correcting. But this is not just a story about a new acronym. It's a story about what happens when medicine names something too narrowly, builds decades of research, treatment, and understanding around that name, and then has to admit the map was incorrect. So we're going to look at what PCOS actually is, how it got named, and why that name caused so many problems, and what PMOS could mean for the future. Time to get out of the tunnels. I'm sick of this gaslighting. Ladies and gentlemen, friends and family, for almost 100 years, millions of people were diagnosed with a condition called polycystic ovary syndrome, PCOS. And for almost 100 years, that name sent everyone looking in the wrong direction. Because there's just one problem. What the fuck even is polycystic ovary syndrome? Millions of people have been diagnosed with a condition that was named after something it was never really about. It's like going to a doctor with a headache and being told, all right, let's check your toes. Because this so-called syndrome was never simply a problem about cysts. And the word polycystic did what bad language always does in medicine. It narrowed the frame. It made patients think they had dangerous cysts. It made doctors focus on ultrasound images. It made research and public understanding orbit one visible body part, while the real issue was happening across the entire system. And now, after decades of patients being dismissed, misdiagnosed, and told their symptoms were unrelated, the medical world has finally started correcting the name. PCOS has now been renamed Polyendocrine Metabolic Ovarian Syndrome, PMOS, with the medical world entering a transition period as guidelines, clinics, textbooks, and everyday language catch up. PMOS. It's not just a new acronym, it's a correction, and it's a pretty massive one, because changing the name means admitting the old name sent everyone looking in the wrong direction. And those bad directions turned into a bad map, not slightly outdated, not just missing a few details, bad enough that generations of patients were forced to navigate their own bodies using directions that did not match their body's symptoms. Welcome to the story of how medicine misunderstood PCOS for almost 100 years and why PMOS might be finally the beginning of a better map. So if the old name was basically wrong, what are we actually dealing with? Because if you ask most people, or even do a quick, very ill-advised Google search, you'll get a pretty simple mental image. Something like, you've got an ovary, it has cysts on it. Simple, clean, easy to understand. Except that's not really what's happening. First of all, those cysts aren't cysts. They're follicles, small, fluid-filled sacs where eggs normally develop during a menstrual cycle. In a typical cycle, one follicle becomes dominant and releases an egg. But in this condition, hormone regulation can interrupt that process. Multiple follicles may begin developing and then stall. On an ultrasound, they can look like a string of pearls, but here's the key point. They're not dangerous cysts, they're not tumours, and they're not even required for diagnosis in every case. You can have this follicle pattern and not have the condition, and you can have the condition and not have the follicle pattern. That alone should already tell you something is off with the PCOS name. And what we're actually dealing with is not just an ovarian condition either. It's a hormonal, endocrine, metabolic, and reproductive condition. A whole body regulation problem. Think of it less like something is wrong with the ovaries and more like the body's control system is slightly out of sync. Hormones, such as androgens and metabolic systems involving insulin and blood sugar regulation, can affect everything from energy to skin to hair growth to ovulation. And because it's systemic, the effects don't stay in one place. They show up everywhere. There are metabolic symptoms, insulin resistance, energy crashes, weight crashes that did not behave normally. Dermatological symptoms, acne, increased facial or body hair, or hair thinning on the scalp. Psychological, fatigue, brain fog, anxiety, and that exhausting feeling that something's wrong even when you keep being told everything looks normal. Reproductive, irregular or absent menstrual cycles, ovulation issues, and fertility challenges for some people. It's not just one symptom, it's an entire catalogue. which causes a system-wide knock-on effect, and that's why the old name failed so badly. Because it pointed everyone towards one visible feature on an ultrasound, when the real story was happening across the whole body. We were trying to understand a full system condition without ever looking at the full system. So how did we get trapped in this linguistic cul-de-sac? To understand that, we have to travel back to 1935 into the offices of two American gynecologists, Irving Stein and Michael Leventhal. Stein and Leventhal noticed a recurring pattern in a small group of women. Irregular periods, masculine pattern hair growth, and, when they performed surgery, enlarged ovaries with a thick outer layer and clusters of tiny sacs inside. They published a paper. The condition became known as Stein-Leventhal syndrome, and because they were gynecologists looking through the lens of gynecology, they defined the condition by the most striking physical thing they could see: the cysts, the so-called cysts, on the ovaries. This was not a medical conspiracy. It's what happens when medicine mistakes visibility for importance. And in 1930s, endocrinology, the study of hormones, was still developing. They did not have the tools to measure subtle metabolic changes, track insulin pathways, or understand the full hormonal landscape of the body. They could not see the chemical landscape, they could only map the physical geography. Eventually, Stein-Leventhal syndrome faded out and the descriptive term polycystic ovary syndrome took its place. It sounded modern, it sounded clinical, and it sounded precise. But it carried the same wrong framing forward, and that's exactly how systems harden. Once a name enters the textbooks, it stops being a hypothesis and starts becoming infrastructure. It appears on medical school exams. It shapes research priorities. It influences funding. It changes what doctors are trained to look for. It changes what patients are told to worry about. And over time, the original framing becomes harder and harder to challenge because medicine does not rewrite its own foundations easily. It usually builds on top of them. By the time science developed the tools to understand the wider endocrine and metabolic picture, the misunderstanding had already been built into the architecture of modern medicine. The ovaries were not irrelevant, but they were never the whole story. They were only one landmark on a much larger map. And because the map was labelled wrong, everyone kept starting in the wrong place. Doctors looked there. Research kept circling back there. Patients were told to focus there, not because the ovaries did not matter, but because the name made them look like the center of the entire condition. And once medicine builds a map, it does not sit in a textbook. Science gets built around it. Research follows it, diagnosis follows it, treatment follows it, medical training follows it. And once all those roads are built, no one wants to admit the map was wrong. Because by then, correcting the map means questioning almost 100 years of research, funding, training, and treatment. When a medical definition is broken, it's not just an academic debate. The weight of that error falls directly onto patients, because if the name points to the wrong place, care often follows. You go to a dermatologist for the acne, they treat the surface, but the issue may be hormonal. You go to a nutritionist or GP due to your irregular weight changes. They tell you to eat less, without always understanding that insulin regulation and metabolic function may be a part of the problem. You go to a mental health professional for anxiety, fatigue, or brain fog, and those symptoms may be treated as isolated psychological events disconnected from the rest of your body. You go to a gynecologist for irregular cycles, and suddenly the whole condition becomes about reproduction. Because the system is fragmented, the care becomes fragmented. Patients are left acting as their own general contractors. They are the ones carrying the paperwork between specialists. They're the ones connecting the symptoms. They're the ones asking why their skin, weight, mood, energy, and cycle all seem to be part of the same story, yet every doctor treats them as separate issues. And then comes the ultimate bottleneck. Because of the old name and the old framing, many patients were historically not taken seriously until fertility became the issue. Explicitly or implicitly, the message was, come back when you want a baby, and we'll deal with it then. Imagine telling someone with early-stage heart disease, your blood pressure is dangerously high, but let's wait until you have a heart attack before we act. It would be considered negligent. But in women's health, this kind of delay has often been normalized. This is where the gaslit feeling comes from. being handed a birth control pill to suppress symptoms without a proper explanation, being told to lose weight without anyone explaining why your metabolism may be behaving differently, being told your blood work is perfectly normal while your body keeps sending distress signals, being told it's stress, being told it's anxiety, being told it's just being part of a woman. It's an exhausting cycle of being misheard, misdiagnosed, and misunderstood, all because the sign on the door made everyone look for cysts on ovaries while the fire was spreading through the whole building. But the tide is finally turning. For years, researchers, clinicians, and patients advocates argued that the name polycystic ovary syndrome was doing damage. It was misleading, it was too narrow, it makes anyone immediately think of cysts on ovaries, and it failed to reflect the condition's endocrine, metabolic, psychological, dermatological, and reproductive reality. And now, after a long international process involving medical experts, patient groups, and advocacy organizations, the condition has been renamed. Polyendocrine Metabolic Ovarian Syndrome, PMOS. Replacing polycystic with polyendocrine metabolic changes the starting point now. It tells a medical student from day one, do not just look for cysts, do not just look at the ovaries, look at the endocrine system, look at metabolic health, look at insulin regulation, look at skin, mood, weight, cycles, and long-term risk. Look at the whole person. And that shift matters because the name does not just describe reality. It directs attention, it shapes research, it guides clinical pathways, it influences what gets funded, what gets screened for, what gets dismissed, and what gets treated. The rename doesn't magically fix care overnight. The biology has not changed. The condition remains what it always was. The body does not care what acronym we use, but this was never really about semantics. It was about the framing, because the framing has consequences. The old name told medicine to stare at the ovary. The new name tells medicine to look at the system. That's not a small change. We're finally admitting we've got to draw out a new map. And now that new map has to be relearned and rebuilt upon by doctors, patients, textbooks, clinics, websites, insurance systems even, and especially everyday conversations. Because it may have been renamed, but now we've all got to catch up. And so it's time to get out of the tunnels. For nearly a century, millions of people were handed a name that made their condition sound like a cyst-specific problem, a fertility problem, a reproductive inconvenience. But what they were living through every day was bigger than that. Their symptoms were treated as isolated fragments instead of pieces of a systemic puzzle. Skin symptoms treated as skin issues. Weight problems treated as a discipline issue. Anxiety and fatigue treated as stress-related when stress was just another symptom. And the patient was left trying to explain that all of this felt connected, while the system kept treating it as separate. That is the damage of a medical name that becomes too narrow. It doesn't sit on a page, it tells doctors where to look, it tells researchers what to study, and it tells funding bodies what deserves attention. And for decades, the name focused attention on the ovarian features such as cysts that didn't necessarily exist. Something was named based on what medicine could clearly identify at the time. Then, the name shaped what medicine continued to prioritize and investigate. PCOS was never just about cysts, and it was never only about the ovaries. Even PMOS still reflects that ovarian connection, but the shift matters because it moves the condition away from a definition built around cysts and closer to a broader understanding of the metabolic and systemic patterns involved. Changing the map means entire infrastructure built around it has to be questioned. A century of research, treatment, funding, education, and public understanding now has to be re-examined through a better frame. Some of it will hold up, some of it will need to be rebuilt. In another 100 years, medicine will almost certainly look back at parts of what we believe today and realize that this map was incomplete too. That is the nature of science. It evolves as knowledge evolves, and every revision changes how people are diagnosed, studied, treated, and understood. For millions of people who were dismissed, misdiagnosed, or forced to connect the dots themselves, that shift came after decades of unnecessary confusion and suffering. A better name means a better starting point. A better starting point means better questions, and better questions are how medicine eventually finds better answers. PMOS is not the end of the story. It's the moment the map begins to change, and the beginning of better care, better research, and a better understanding of the condition people have been living with the entire time. Thank you, everyone. Thank you all so much. Hold on. Hi. PCOS becoming PMOS, it doesn't erase the confusion, the dismissal, or the years of people trying to connect the dots themselves. Many people might not even be aware of this name change or the change in the medicine behind it. But hopefully, this shift does mark a better future and hopefully better care for everybody, right? So thank you again. Thank you all. I've been Kevin from Clanker Radio Live. This has been a short little video. I hope you liked it. Click that like button. Click that subscribe button. Thank you again. And I'll see you next time. Thanks again. Goodbye. 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 Goodbye.